So now we begin. At first, I was going to do this in one session, Cinema at War Part 1. But then I realized there was so much information, and in the summertime especially, we don't want to be here for 2 to 3 hours. I have broken it down to Part 1 today, and then Part 2 later in the fall, a date to be announced. Let me just move something away. Sorry, I am trying to get everyone to see the screen. That, of course, in that drawing is Vladimir Lenin, who believed that of all the arts, film, cinema was the most important. It could unite a country, especially a country where there was a great amount, when he was living, of illiteracy. And it could also try to destroy your enemies by painting a negative picture. Very quickly after, let me just also change, sorry, things move about very, very quickly. Okay. I'm still struggling with this, apologies. Very quickly after Hitler took power, he and Joseph Goebbels also used film to try to bring together Germany and also to create a very, very negative view of the Jewish people around the world, but especially in Germany itself. And I'm trying, I don't know if Neely can help me, a whole page. Okay. I have to go to school for this. But while Germany and also Italy were going to use cinema for their own purposes, when Americans went to see films from 1934 through almost nearly Pearl Harbor, they got to see such films as these, The Count of Monte Cristo and Don Juan, screwball comedies, Shirley Temple, The Wizard of Oz, and dramas where when they were criminals, the criminals were always punished, unlike before 1934, where criminals often escaped any sort of penalty or jail sentence. But during this period, unfortunately, anti-Semitism increased greatly. And there were many factors for this surge. Certainly the Depression, the change in demographics, which some people did not tolerate, people looking at the greater percentage of Italians, Greeks, and Eastern Europeans of whatever religion, but including Jews, who came into the country from the late 1800s through the beginning of World War I. Not everyone liked that. Immigration laws were changed by Congress, limiting people from the Southern Mediterranean, Eastern Mediterranean, and Eastern Europe. Quotas were started at many prestigious colleges in the United States, including Yale, Harvard, Columbia. And also accompanying this was the rise in hate groups. The Nazi Bund, also called the Friends of the New Germany, the Silver Shirts, defenders of the Christian faith, the Christian Front, and the Knights of the White Camellia. Also, around this time, Henry Ford, as pictured there, distributed in the Dearborn Independent, a newspaper that he controlled, a synopsis or a summary in different parts of a notorious book, which is still published today, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And this would start, or at least continue, the belief by conspiracy theorists that a cabal of Jewish elders, whatever that means, were trying to control the world both through journalism, in the government, in finance, and as Jews began to create the studio system, owning and running not just the moguls as they were called at the time, but also executives and others in the studios. Many of the studios, such as MGM, Columbia, Warner Brothers, for instance, also used cinema, allegedly, to control how Americans thought and how they behaved. These are a picture of the Nazi Bund rally. There were many of them with hundreds, if not thousands, of pro-Nazis, especially in the Eastern Seaboard and some other places of the United States, and also, believe it or not, in Southern California, which was a target looked at by Hitler for trying to raise awareness of the good things about fascism and have people want a fascist United States. Two very unfortunate people who also grew in power among these hate mongers was Gerald Burton, who you can see here on the left. And also he was called the Jayhawk Nazi. He was in Kansas. And also William Dudley Pelley of the Silver Shirts. And his group not only spewed hate, but also were known for murdering people who they didn't agree with. Among the people, and we'll show a picture of him later, was Father Coughlin, who was also nicknamed the Radio Priest. And he was, had maybe as high as 14 million people listening to him once a week on his radio show. He was an isolationist who didn't want us to get later in the 1930s into war against Germany, and also not particularly wanting us to give aid to Great Britain, as Great Britain was continuing to struggle, a quite lonely struggle before we entered after Pearl Harbor. Movie moguls, or I should say the studio heads, of which most of them at that time were Jewish, also were targeted for the control of American minds, for sexual perversion, for all sorts of crimes, for being selling drugs. Anything that could be considered sinful was put down to their doorstep. And this was a flyer, an actual flyer that was put around Southern California, pasted up on lampposts and stores, etc. The studio execs were not just worried about their own safety, but especially if it could hurt their studios, whether or not such things would be believed, and if, as they always worried about, would the United States government step in and try to control more of the studio output by censorship or by changing or looking at the financial dealings of the studios. We don't have time to go into it now. You could ask me in Q&A, but the studios had a very, very interesting vertical financial arrangement, which was very profitable for them. And eventually the Supreme Court ruled against it, but after World War II. So they were always fearful that if things got too controversial, the government could step in and change everything. Now, one might say, and you'd be interested in why Meyer Lansky's picture is there, but you may say, well, maybe Hollywood didn't really know about what was happening in the Third Reich, in Mussolini's Italy, in Bund rallies. Were they going to Bund rallies? Was it in the New York Times or an LA paper? But indeed, these rallies and hate groups were quite visible for those whose eyes were open. There's a book that I recommend being in at least your group's library, synagogue library, maybe in your own library, Hitler in Los Angeles, by an excellent speaker, Professor Stephen Ross of University of Southern California. And he details how both the East Coast, the New York area, and Southern California were prime targets for trying to change the citizens' viewpoint of fascism. Here in the top, we see, and this is the only photo I could find, a small photo. This is Steve Ross, the author, but here is Leon Lewis, who Ross calls a spy master. He was a lawyer. He was a soldier in World War I, grew up in the Midwest, worked as a staff person for the ADL in the beginning days of the ADL, looking at movies to see if anything was anti-Semitic. And then after the war, for health reasons, he moved to Southern California, where, well, I'll first look at Meyer Lansky, but we'll find out he created a network of spies, not official spies with training, but people who knew German, who maybe were born in Germany, and especially non-Jews, who the pro-Nazis would think could be sympathetic to their cause. But let me talk a little bit about Meyer Lansky, just because the photos are arranged that way. Why do I have his picture there? Well, many people knew about the Bund rallies. As I said, there were sometimes with hundreds, sometimes with thousands of people who were supporting the new Germany. And the rallies often had gigantic flags of the Third Reich billowing. They had security guards with brown shirts flanking the podium where the speaker would be standing. And the brown shirted guards would often have an armband with a swastika on it. The rallying call to support Nazi Germany, to try to encourage Congress to also, and the president and anyone, the press, to believe in Hitler's cause, was a great fearsome thing for people who did not want it in America. And one judge, a Jewish judge, former congressperson, didn't know what to do. Because of the First Amendment, the Bund supporters could rally, could speak, could write, but he wanted to do something, and I'm not encouraging this, but the judge reached out to Meyer Lansky, who I think most of you have heard about, was a gangster at the time. And in any event, he was told, Lansky, could you get some of your other gangster friends and maybe some other people who are tough guys to beat up the pro-Nazi supporters at these rallies as they entered or left the buildings, the stadiums, the arenas, but don't murder anyone. And Meyer Lansky accomplished that, which led to, including with his friends working in New Jersey, associated with Murder Incorporated, fewer and fewer people going to the rallies, knowing there was a chance to be beaten up, having your leg broken, your arm broken, or a broken jaw. One of the gangsters in New Jersey was warned not to murder anyone, but he said, can I marinate them? Which meant beating them up. In any event, that was effective, though a violent solution. Another way was to counter Hitler in Los Angeles with a spy network. And almost as soon, even in 1933, when Hitler came to power, later on in the spring, this captain here, Pape or Pap, was sent to Los Angeles to encourage people to support the Nazi cause. In rallies, in meetings, they especially, and here you could see one of their offices in LA with a swastika flag outside the office building. What they knew was that a huge number, as high as 1/3 of unemployed, disabled veterans were living in Southern California in 1933. They felt that this was a good place to start educating the public about the good things of Nazism. These soldiers were disgruntled. They often were unemployed. They may be injured, disabled, and a lot of them had no place to live because it was the Depression. So they purchased places where people who were unemployed and veterans of World War I would live, be fed, be taken care of, hoping that when the time was right and maybe a coup could be established to create an American Reich, these former soldiers would help the Nazi cause. But Leon Lewis, whose little photo I had shown you, I couldn't find a larger one. And these are some pictures at the time of American Nazis. He created, after he moved to LA and he was already a lawyer from the University of Chicago, but after he left the A as a staff person, but still was a volunteer, created his own spy network. And he he didn't pay people necessarily, but he looked for people who perhaps had served in World War I on behalf of Germany, who had credentials which could convince the Nazis that they were on their side. And they went undercover and tried to find out what was happening. That's how they found out about the lure to reach out to the veterans, and also, which I'm sure I never heard about before I read this book, and maybe none of you had heard about it either, there was actually a plot to assassinate such people as James Cagney, who's not Jewish, but very famous, and also on the more anti-Nazi side, Jack Benny, Eddie Cantor, Charlie Chaplin, who many people thought was Jewish but was not, Sam Goldwyn, Al Jolson, Frederick March, Louis B. Mayer, Paul Muni, who was Jewish, Walter Winchell, who was Jewish, Sylvia Sidney, who was, and director William Wyler, who was Jewish, among others. Lewis went to the LA Sheriff's Department, he went to the police, and even to the FBI with information about what was happening at these Nazi meetings and rallies, and also when he found out about the plot to kill celebrities. Eventually, that was taken seriously by the FBI, and it was stopped, and some of the plotters did go to jail. But in the beginning, many of the law enforcement people that he went to did not think that the Nazis in America were a big threat. They were more worried after the rise in communism for a communist threat in the United States, and didn't even investigate further until Lewis got more information. Now, why didn't the studios write a script, make a movie about all of this once it came out? Certainly, people were aware of the Nazi rallies. That would have made a good script, an interesting film. What was happening in Nazi Germany with the creation of Dachau, with the Nuremberg laws in 1935, with resistance by some journalists who were then sent to Dachau, all these different things would have been a source of movie making, but they were mostly silent. As someone wrote, there was a 4-letter word which was missing from most American films of the 1930s, from 33, 34 through almost the time of Pearl Harbor. The 4-letter word was Nazi. There was also a 3-letter word that basically disappeared from most Hollywood films, though it had been very much in the movies made in Hollywood before 1933, 34, and that was the 3-letter word Jew. Jewish characters basically disappeared, not entirely, but greatly in the 30s, and even during World War II, we were hardly visible until 1947. There were a few exceptions, The Great Dictator by Charlie Chaplin, but really, I hate to use the word Judenrein, but we were basically invisible. Why? The answer is primarily three things: money, revenue, and the box office, as well as the censorship czar of the very well known at the time Hayes office, which wanted to make sure that films in America were not controversial, could continue to be made without federal involvement or federal censorship, because there were state censors which were enough for censorship, and also where foreign sales, especially to countries like Germany and Italy, could continue unabated. What was the Hayes office, and who controlled it? When did it begin, and why? I've given talks about censorship, and I'm just going to do it very quickly to review about censorship in Hollywood. And as soon as films, even in the late last decade of the 1800s, when films like this, the scandalous The Kiss, and that's as far as it went, a very chaste kiss, were put on celluloid, there were calls by many people for censorship, that films not only were sinful, but they taught children, young adults, and especially immigrants, who a lot of these pro-censorship people felt did not have significant knowledge to know the difference between yes and no, and sin and morality. If you showed a film about a train robbery, as you see a promotion banner for that here, that would teach children and the innocent about how to rob a train. That's a no-no. Nickelodeons, people were crushed together, sitting on benches. The places were filthy. And for many other reasons, Nickelodeons also added a sense of depravity, of sin to the film industry. And of course, to create sales, the studios themselves, often in these very short 5-cent movies, which were only a few minutes long, gave names to the films, like The Corset Model, or Seaside Flirtation, or What the Groom Saw. Maybe he just saw the cake, but the title of these films often was considered very pink and more scandalous than the movies themselves. This was especially done during the early days of the Depression to boost the sales at a time when people had to choose film or food for their families. In 1915, the issue of could a state government censor films went to the Supreme Court, and in votes 9-0 said yes. The reason being that films did not have the right, like newspapers, to include anything they wanted out of freedom of the press, of speech, etc. Films were more like a machine, a tool, a refrigerator, a lawnmower, whatever. And you could, as the manufacturer, be kept to making sure that they were safe. They were an appliance, so to speak. Even though they were cultural appliance, they were not like a newspaper or a book. And eventually, because of all the cries for censorship and also scandals, many of you may have heard of Fatty Arbuckle, a very corpulent silent film actor, extremely corpulent, maybe over 300 pounds, to celebrate, I forget exactly what, something in his life. He drove from LA to San Francisco, and I believe it was the St. Francis Hotel where he had a party celebration with a lot of models. And one of them tragically died. And the doctors blamed that he had had sexual relations with her, and his corpulence ended up killing her. It later turned out that wasn't true, but there were 3 trials, and eventually he was found innocent. But this scandal and others, drug use, a murder, etc., got the Hollywood studios to create the Motion Picture Distributors and Producers of America. I'm just going to call it MPPDA. And this was a cartoon from 1922. And it said, and William Hayes was put in charge. His friends expect him to clean up the place in short order, meaning Hollywood. And he created the Motion Picture Producers, as I said, MPPDA, and a code of do's and don'ts, which the studios were to follow in order to not be too controversial. There's a reason why I'm talking about all this, because of Article 10, which we'll learn about, and deals eventually with how Will Hayes's censorship czar looked at Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy. The code was supposed to be followed, and it was a very simple code, maybe a dozen or so rules, maybe 20. And I'm going to just skip. But the studios did not. To have sales, as I said, especially as we move into the Depression, they sold sex and sin and crime and violence. And the studios just did not listen to all these things. People were especially angry at King Kong. This isn't King Kong, it's another movie, because people who we could say had a dirty mind kept on thinking that King Kong was going to seduce the poor woman at the top of, I think it was it the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building, where he enslaved her for a while. But in any event, in 1930, Catholic bishops began to put pressure. And 2 people in particular, Father Lord and a trade paper editor named Quigley, created and wrote a much more long-winded and intricate production code, not just do's and don'ts with a few dozen, not even a dozen laws, but one which had a philosophy that it was wrong to be sinful in the movies. It would hurt our youth. It would spoil our morality, but dealt with rule after rule in great detail, not just don't show crime winning or don't show people being immoral. And this was the cover of the code when it was accepted early on in 1930. But because it was a depression, guess what? The studios accepted it and then tore it up. There was sin and more sin in the Sign of the Cross, which was a Cecil B. DeMille blockbuster at the time, about Roman rulers, one of them played by Charles Lawton. This was Frederick March, a silent film star. This was Claudette Colbert married to the emperor. It was quite sexy for the time. She was naked in a milk bath. Actually, milk was used. And she wrote once that it was horrible because the milk under the lights of the studio cameras actually curdled, and she still was in it take after take. There was a lesbian scene, and also there were scenes of Christians, and this was about the early Christian period, being torn apart by gladiators, crocodiles, and lions. There were also movies like this, and often, as I said before, crime did pay, with the criminals often wearing expensive clothing, going to nightclubs at a time where the average American certainly hardly had enough money to buy new clothes or to go to a nightclub. When several Catholic bishops realized that the studios were not living up to this, they created a Legion of Decency where on Sundays, I'll just wait for a minute, where on Sundays, their priests in the parishes would demand, or at least really plead, that the congregation would sign a pledge saying that they would not go to movies. And there were movies every week, brand new movies, plenty of them, much more than today's world, unless the movies were approved by the Catholic Church. And millions of Catholics, and also some thousands of Protestants and Jews, would agree to this philosophy. The studios were aghast, and they insisted that William Hayes would hire someone, and this was the man, Joseph Ignatius Breen, to make sure that the code and all of its regulations were followed. Breen was an isolationist. He was also very severe, and he made sure that crime did not pay, that if you committed adultery, which was many of the films before the code, before 1934, when the code had Breen as the censor, there was a lot of adultery in the films and people were not punished at the end, that all the rules would be followed. And Breen was very strict. The reason we're talking about this was Article 10, called National Feelings. Quote, "The history, institutions, prominent people, and citizenry of all nations shall be represented fairly." He sometimes would say sympathetically, but what does fairly mean? If something is really happening, if there's a dictator who treats his citizens horribly, should you not be able to show that in a film? His answer was no. And especially, he cared about movies that dealt with Germany under Hitler and Mussolini's Italy. He would not agree to a seal of approval without which movies could not be shown in most American movie theaters. So the studios, fearful of a total boycott by Catholics and including a great number of Protestants and Jews, afraid that sales may be cut off in Nazi Germany as threatened by Goebbels and others who were controlling the German film industry, wanting revenue from German box office and Italian box office, the studios complied. And they would do nothing, or at least would agree to what Breen said, with very, very little disagreement or anger, or trying to sneak in a film or two, which Breen would not like. I should say, or you may ask, why did the studios care about Germany or Italy in the 1930s? Because now and then, foreign sales are necessary for the bottom line of Hollywood. Studios, at least the major studios, often realized at least 30% of their income in the 1930s, before 39, when things changed, of course, because of the war. But before the war started, they saw at least 30, sometimes as high as 50% of their income from foreign sales. And now, of course, in America and Hollywood today, studios are looking at certain markets to enlarge, increase their bottom line, their revenue, especially places like China. And that is also why we see so many films being made with superheroes and fewer films that are smaller in nature. Dramas and romantic dramas are much fewer because they don't sell to the same degree overseas, where there are over 1 billion potential audience goers. In the beginning of this period, and we'll talk about it in part 2, Germany, Nazi Germany, told the studios they could not have Jews working in their sales office inside Germany. They only wanted to have working for RKO or Paramount or MGM non-Jews. The studios complied. Warner Brothers did not, and they left Germany, as well as RKO. The other studios, for the most part, the largest studios, I don't know about all the smaller studios, but we're talking Paramount and MGM in particular, stayed in until World War II, that started with the invasion of Poland by the Nazis in September of 1939. And even shortly before that, when Germany said, we just don't want American films. So then it didn't matter, of course. But the Warner Brothers really tried, especially Harry, who was seen there. I believe that's Harry. There were several Warner Brothers, including especially Jack, who was much more well-known. And he and Harry did not get along at all, and often didn't speak to each other. But Harry was a much more traditional Jew and pledged that he would do something to alert America and those getting Warner Brothers films about the Nazi menace. And one of those films, which was released in 1937, was Robin Hood, The Adventures of Robin Hood, starring Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland. Now, you may say, what in the world does Robin Hood have to do with talking about the threat, the menace, the horrible, horrible things going on by 1937? The Nuremberg laws were already passed. Dachau was already a place to put people who resisted fascism. Well, years later, the star Olivia de Havilland was asked, did you know the reason why Robin Hood was made as a way to be a warning? And she said, yes, we were aware. Prince John, who of course is part of the Robin Hood adventure, was considered like Hitler, a dictator, a villain. And people were to think about in the audience the horrors of a dictatorship, even if it was at the time of Robin Hood. Warner Brothers did their best to be in a cinematic war with Nazi Germany. They did cartoons both before the war, our entry just after Pearl Harbor, and afterwards with different animal cartoon figures dressed up as Hitler, making fun. There was something with Porky Pig, and here's, forget the name of the rabbit, but making fun of the Nazis, making fun of Hitler, Goebbels, and Göring. That was considered okay by Joseph Ignatius Breen, the censor czar of the Hayes office, because it was a cartoon and the Nazis didn't care about it. It wasn't serious. But the Nazis did send someone there to make sure that other films, well, non-animated films, not cartoons, were not showing anything, not showing stories that showed Hitler in a bad light or Nazi Germany in general. And the person they sent was George Giesling, who is next to here, the very famous film director from Nazi Germany, the director of a documentary on the 1936 Munich, I think it was 36, but the Olympics held in Munich, and also the very notorious film Triumph of the Will, which showed Hitler in his plane descending from the clouds as if he was a god. Gosling, I'm sorry, I spelled it wrong here, so I apologize. Sometimes you have autocorrect, and that's what happens. Giesling was sent to Los Angeles to be a connector to the film industry, and he worked very closely with the censor czar Breen. demanding quite often that when he heard about films that were dealing with Nazi Germany or anything to deal with Hitler or one of the leaders, that he would be able to see the script and he could comment on it and tell Breen whether it was a bad mistake. He threatened, along with Goebbels, who was in charge of propaganda for Nazi Germany, that if a studio showed films or made films, even if they didn't play in Germany, that were negative, that Nazi Germany would ban all of that studio's films, maybe forever. And therefore, there was a fear among the studios. Warner Brothers didn't care, but of course they didn't make the films they wanted early enough in the 1930s. But they were also worried that if one studio made a negative film, which the Nazis felt was slanderous, that maybe all of the American studios would be destroyed for German sales. Warner Brothers, and especially Harry, made films which were not in the beginning negative towards Nazi Germany, except for the cartoons, but tried to show the anti-Semitism in history and what it did to Jews. And this was in the film The Life of Emile Zola, which dealt with, and this is Paul Muni, dealt with the trial and the subsequent happenings with Emile Zola, a journalist, of the Dreyfus affair, the Dreyfus trial in the last decade of the 1800s, a trial at which, as you all know, Theodor Herzl was at for a news covering for a newspaper. In Juarez, which starred Paul Muni again, dressed in like Abraham Lincoln, but he wasn't playing Lincoln, and Betty Davis, it dealt with the attempt of France to put in one of their aristocrats in Mexico to rule over the Mexican people, and the refusal of many Mexicans to accept this dictatorship. In other words, trying to make films into metaphors to show the dangers of dictators rather than actually talking about Nazi Germany itself. The Black Legion did deal with just make it a little bigger, with a fascist hate group that couldn't stand Jews, people of color, immigrants, Catholics, etc. Why did the Censor Breen allow the film to be made? Because it did have a connection to Nazi Germany. The reason was the Black Legion actually existed in the United States in the Midwest. They're responsible for a few murders. Some of their people went to jail. And therefore, because it was a true story, though this was a feature film starring a very young Humphrey Bogart, Breen allowed it to happen. Though they did not mention prejudice against Jews. As I said, just like in Emile Zola movie, I don't believe the word Jew was mentioned at all during the film, even though, of course, Dreyfus was set up as a traitor to his country, to France, because of anti-Semitism. So Black Legion did warn about hate groups, but did not talk about Germany. Here's a picture of the Black Legion uniform, which looks a little bit like a swastika, and Humphrey Bogart taking a pledge that he would follow them to his death. A film that came later in 1939, when things began to open up a bit and Breen was a little bit more willing to see films made, was Confessions of a Nazi Spy. It was more like a docudrama. For years, I looked for a print. I finally found a VHS tape of the film, and unfortunately, it put me to sleep. It was very slow. So I've never shown it. to an audience. But it was allowed in 1939, starring Edward G. Robinson, I think he was an FBI agent, and it was done by Warner Brothers because it was based on the true story of a spy ring of Nazi Germany, which was stopped, and a few of the spies arrested by the FBI, and therefore was allowed to be shown. Their advertisement said, "The picture that will open the eyes of 130 million Americans," or as one ad said, "A film willing to call a swastika a swastika." Paramount, as you can read here, urged Warner Brothers not to make the film because they still hoped for a few of their films to be sold to Nazi Germany, and they were afraid that Warner Brothers was making the business bad for everyone. The film was shown to the Production Code Authority, the group in the Hayes office that looked at the films, read the scripts, and you had to have your script approved before the film could be made. And there were several people who would read the scripts and everything. And one of them said to Breen that the movie should be made more neutral. And he asked, and this is a quote from one of the books I have, "Where did the film highlight all of Hitler's positive achievements?" The concept that if you said something bad about the Nazis, you should also have something good in the same film, or have a good film and a bad film released at the same time, was being circulated in places, and we'll see in a minute, in the United States Senate, for people who really wanted not to show all the horrible things of the Nazis, but a few little good things as well. Also a Warner Brothers film, and you know this man here, Gary Cooper. The Warner Brothers were very disturbed by the isolationism that was growing in such groups as America First, and by such people as Charles Lindbergh. Sergeant York was a real life person who belonged to a very small Christian denomination, which was pacifist. But when he tried to get out of World War I because of his own pacifist beliefs, it was not allowed because the denomination he belonged to was not recognized by whether the Army or the American government. So he served, he won a Medal of Honor. And even though he still believed that he was a pacifist, he would say, and this is a picture of the real Sergeant York, that there were some causes for which you had to go to war, and fighting the Nazis was one of them. And so for the first time, he allowed his own story, his biopic, his biography, so to speak, to be filmed by the Warner Brothers. But he would choose Gary Cooper. He was very careful who would represent him on celluloid. And he also chose the woman, the actress who would be his wife. Another story, which actually took the fangs out of this film, is about the MGM film, Idiot's Delight. It's not the best film, but it's very interesting. Maybe someday we can see clips in person. The film was purchased for over $100,000, the rights to make it into a film, by the playwright, the Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, Robert Sherwood. It was an anti-war film about Italy starting a war. I believe it was their bombing Paris, but I can't remember because I never saw the play. But MGM bought the rights, and all of a sudden, Joseph Breen knocked on their door and said, I have told the Italian consulate, who's the person there who's dealing with films, that you're going to make this film, and they don't want it made. Breen worked very closely with the Italian consulate in LA, and MGM did fight back. This was already very late in the game in 1939, when sales of MGM films in Italy and in Germany were very, very small. So the studio was no longer counting on making a lot of money from these two countries. First, the Italian consulate, I'll just say Italy, makes it easier. Italy wanted the name of It Needs Delight to be removed from the film. Of course, they wouldn't have purchased for more than $100,000 the rights to the play if they couldn't use the title. So they said no. But they did agree to certain things. One, it was made into a romantic drama with a lot of dancing by this guy here, Clark Gable, who became a song and dance man and a romance, with a romance in a country that was no longer Italy. In order to show that it wasn't Italy, when some of the people in this song and dance troupe were trying to get on a train to leave the country, they said, now we're going to Italy. So it was obvious that they weren't in Italy while they were performing there. They wanted to have some people speak in another language and not just English, to give it a European flair. They were not allowed, or did not, MGM agreed that they would not use Italian. They chose instead Esperanto. And it went on and on and on about that. Basically, the real power of the film, the anti-war element, was removed, and the film really no longer had the gravitas that the play had. MGM was one of the last to come to the table in regard to showing anything realistic about Nazi Germany or against fascism. And this film, which I have shown, Mortal Storm, is interesting because of all the famous stars who were in the film, came out in 1940 after World War II had started in Europe. It starred, and if we were all in person, I'd ask you to, I can't remember his name, the guy who played, the actor who played the Wizard of Oz in The Wizard of Oz. It starred Robert Stack as a young Nazi. It starred Dr. Kildare from TV himself, Robert Young, and as a wonderful anti-Nazi veterinarian student, Jimmy Stewart. And it was about, what starts with the birthday of Dr. Roth. He is a doctor and a professor of medicine, and everyone is celebrating his birthday. That evening, they come to his house to meet his wife, his second wife, who's not Jewish, his daughter and son with his second wife. They're horrible, horrible pro-Nazi cook and maid, and also Jimmy Stewart and Robert Young. And they're listening on the radio during the birthday celebration, because it is the day in which Adolf Hitler was named Chancellor of Germany. The cook is ecstatic. She comes running and is delighted. And so is, of course, Robert Young and two other young men at the dinner table. Jimmy Stewart, and this is one of, I forget her name, she's also a very famous actress, are aghast and very upset, as is Dr. Roth's wife, because she says with horrible fear on her face, what is going to happen to people like you? You're a non-Aryan. Throughout the film, which was about non-Aryans being sent to, at that time, Dachau hadn't yet been built, but it would soon, but to a concentration camp, presumably Dachau, one of the first. The word Jew was never mentioned. It's always non-Aryan. Even then in 1940, there was fear of being too obvious. about anti-Semitism. In any event, if you ever can see it, her name is Margaret Sullivan, my apologies. So it is Frank Morgan, who played the Wizard of Oz, James Stewart, very young Robert Stack, and Robert Young. It's really a huge number of people who would later become very famous in the film industry. And it's sad to see Robert Stack, who of course played Eliot Ness as a fierce Nazi. The film that everyone remembers is, of course, The Great Dictator. It was made by one of the smallest studios, of which Charlie Chaplin was one of the co-owners. Many people thought at the time he was Jewish because he was so sympathetic to the Jews of Germany, Austria, Czechoslovakia, etc., who by then were, and came out in 1940, were under the grip of Hitler. And the closing scene of The Great Dictator was a speech against anti-Semitism and dictatorships. This is also a very famous scene showing Hitler controlling the globe. And if you can see the film, it is still worth seeing for Hitler realizing, not Hitler, sorry, that Charlie Chaplin seeing how dangerous Hitler was. But he does say, because there were scenes in it which are frightful in their prophecy, that if he had known of the Holocaust, he could not have shown those films because they deal with the destruction of the Jewish neighborhoods even before the Holocaust occurred. Not everyone wanted America to go to war to help Great Britain. And there were far too many people, including Lindbergh, including John F. Kennedy as a college student, including Lillian Gish even, and others who really believed that we should stay out of the war. We shouldn't give aid to Great Britain. We should support the Neutrality Act of a few years earlier. And in the 1940 period, many of these people began to join the group called America First. Later on, including Wheeler, a senator from Montana, and Senator Gerald Nye, a senator from North Dakota. They were very, very strong isolationists, and of course did not want to use American cinema to fight the Nazis in any way they could. The America First group, and so I realized that people who created another America First group just a few years ago hadn't read their history books, believed that it wouldn't be disastrous if Great Britain did a peace treaty with the Nazis, were not that upset by Europe being run over by the Third Reich troops. And especially Nye said some really dangerous and anti-Semitic things, though he may not have used the word Jew. Let me just find the quote, but in the meantime, as I'm finding it, some of the directors in Hollywood, especially Jewish directors, producers, studios, counted all their films, actually looked at all of them since Hitler took over, and found that of the more than 500 films made, less than 80 actually were political at all. And of those political films, almost none of them, except for maybe the ones I just talked about, dealt with Mussolini's Italy or Nazi Germany at all. The political films may have been about American issues such as the Black Legion or some other things, but they really were not dealing with Hitler or Mussolini. But that didn't soothe the anger of Senator Nye. In August of 1941, just a few months before Pearl Harbor, at an America First rally in the Midwest, he launched an attack against the Roosevelt administration, announcing that he would soon be encouraging a Senate hearing on the use of film to fight the war. And he would study whether the government in America, like the government in Hitler's Germany, were using films, as they did in those countries, to, quote, poison the minds of the American people in order to plunge us into the bloodiest war in history. He went on to accuse American and European bankers and the powerful international munition makers of committing crimes against the American people. To carry on propaganda, he said, you must have money. You know where he was going. But you must also have the instruments of propaganda. It so happens that movie companies have been operating as war propaganda machines. So in his speech, he combined movie studios who everyone knew had, except for one or two studios of the major studios, Jews at the helm, with also bankers, two powerful stereotypes, Jews as using money to control the world, and now using film to control the world. He continued, we all go to the movies. We know how, for far too long, the silver screen has been flooded with movie after movie designed to raise war hysteria. He continued to say that our films are setting aflame the emotions of the American people. They are turning their hatred of Nazi Germany into a blaze. The films are filling them with hatred towards Hitler and making them think, quote, that Hitler will come over here and capture them. He added, who has brought us to the verge of war? Who is pushing and hauling at America to plunge us into World War II? Who is putting up the money for all this propaganda? Lindbergh also at the same time at a rally in the Midwest said also a speech that began to destroy his reputation for many, many in America. His wife had read the speech. He showed it to her before he said it. And she said, you can't say these things. People are going to think of you as a bigot and it's wrong. And he read it anyhow and went over on the radio. I'm not sure if it was in Iowa. Yes, it was. It was a rally in Des Moines, Iowa on September 11th of 1941. He warned the crowd at where he did the speech, the three most important groups who have been pressing this country toward war: the British, Roosevelt, and the Jews. Instead of agitating for war, the Jewish groups in this country should be opposing it, for they will be among the first to fear its consequences. The greatest danger to this country lies in the Jewish ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. And as you may know, Roosevelt was often, his name was changed by people who didn't like his viewpoint to Rosenberg or something like that, to make people feel that he really was Jewish and therefore following what the Jewish community around the world wanted. In any event, Nye encouraged the Interstate Commerce Subcommittee of the Senate to have hearings, which started in the Senate on September 9th, 1941. These people were among those on it. Senator Ernest McFarland and Senator Wheeler Nye was not on it, but he was a witness, and he was going to be their secret, for those who believed in isolationism, their secret weapon against the studios. There were others as well, and the chair of the subcommittee, I think his name was also Clark, chose other isolationists, not all, because he couldn't do that. McFarland, as we see here, supported Roosevelt's positions, supporting Great Britain. He was not an isolationist, but most of them were. And the Senate hearings took place. They would last for around 2 weeks. And the studios, knowing about this, they were there as people to be pointed at and to talk to or scolded. They hired Wendell Willkie, pictured here, the 1940 candidate for presidency for the Republican Party. Willkie, though a Republican, supported much of Roosevelt's foreign policy, and he was very willing to support the studios because he felt, one, that they were not creating a war frenzy, a war fever, and it wouldn't have been so bad had they shown the dangers of fascism. But he was not allowed to be counsel or lawyer as he had thought. He could, he once used the microphone. Some of the Jewish execs of the studios were here: Samuel Goldwyn, Louis B. Mayer, Zucker, Harry Cohn, and of course, the Warner Brothers. There was more than, this was Jack and this was Harry, and one of them I think is Sam, and I can't remember the other. Some of the others were not as well known, but they were all there. They had done their homework. Also yelling at the studios at this time was Father Coughlin, the radio priest, who was an isolationist, and here is Lindbergh. And in any event, they had done their homework, the studios and Willkie. And they had counted how many films were political, as I said, how many dealt with Mussolini, and they said that there was hardly any political films. So we really don't know what you're talking about. At the time, this is actually by the Dr. Seuss. He did cartoons at the time. And in this one, which was in some newspapers across the country, here you have a United States morale, and you see America First eating up and destroying American morale by their attitudes. I should say, as I've written here, that members of America First, which had over 450 chapters across the United States, included John Kennedy, then a college student, Gerald Ford, Lillian Gish, Frank Lloyd Wright, Eddie Rickenbacker, and the senators Nye and Wheeler, as well as Charles Lindbergh. After Lindbergh's speech, America First was not at all happy because most of the people were not anti-Semitic, especially those very noted ones that I just mentioned, and they didn't like the association with Lindbergh and his obvious sentiments. This is also a very famous cartoon of the time. Let me see if I can make it a bit bigger. And made it a little bit bigger. Here, the mother or grandmother or nanny, whoever she is reading a book about Adolf the Wolf. To make it obvious, this is a swastika here. And she says, and the wolf, sorry if this, I don't mean to bother anyone, it's rather graphic verbiage. And the wolf chewed up the children. And those were foreign children, so it doesn't really matter. Obviously meaning the victims of Nazi concentration camps and beatings by the thugs of the Third Reich. In any event, during the hearings besides Hollywood talking about the numbers, which didn't seem to influence Nye as one of the witnesses, or Wheeler, or the others who were there. Wendell Willkie said something, and let me see where it is, because it's an interesting quote. I just have to find it. Okay, here it is. As I said before, many people realizing, who didn't want us to go to war, but realizing that there were a lot of horrible things going on in Nazi Germany, felt that you could try to be more neutral by saying some good things about Hitler. And Wendell Willkie referenced this. And he got a hold of the mic at one point, though he was not allowed to question Nye at all, or the senators. And he questioned whether or not the purpose of this hearing was to have Hollywood Pictures show both sides of the international scene. And he said, and I'm quoting directly, "This, I presume, means that since Charlie Chaplin made a laughable caricature of Hitler in The Great Dictator, the film industry should be forced to employ," and I added the quite rotund Charles Laughton, the actor, to do the same on Winston Churchill. And that, of course, did not sound good to most of the Senate, who were trying to show that their only purpose was being patriotic and not pro-Nazi. But the person, I'm going to go back and show his picture. Okay, let's go back a little bit more. Here, when, not him, sorry. Here, is it here? Yes, Senator McFarland. Senator McFarland really was able to destroy Nye, who is pictured bottom left, by asking him questions. McFarland was on the committee, Nye was a witness, and he said, "You talk about all these films that are creating war fever. Well, how many have you seen? Can you name them? Have you seen this film?" And he had a long list of films, which some people he had read about accused Hollywood of being a little bit negative, such as The Great Dictator, or Mortal Storm, or Sergeant York, etc. And no, I kept on saying, "Don't remember that film. Oh, I forgot that film. No, I really don't remember." And he became a laughingstock for those who were not on his side, for people began to realize that there was an ulterior motive. He just didn't want America to support Great Britain. He didn't want to use cinema to fight the Nazis at all. And he wanted a very, very neutral policy. At the end of 2 weeks, the hearings were concluded for the time being, and they were going to continue, according to the chairperson, in the new year, in January of 1942. We know, of course, what happened in December 7th of 1941, Pearl Harbor. And so the hearings never, ever would continue. After that time, Hollywood would work with the United States government and make training films, would make documentaries, would make films to beef up, to increase the enthusiasm at home, and also make people be more patriotic and showing the bravery of those fighting the fascist world. Sadly, Hollywood missed the opportunity for far too many years to alert the American public and others who viewed their films of the fascist menace. And that is the end of part one. Part two will be probably in November, in a few months. And let me stop sharing the film, So if you want, you can ask me questions in the chat. Let me open up the chat. Are there any questions anyone want to ask? Just type it in your chat and then hit return and it will appear. So I could read them. Or I'm not very good at, well, I could do a gallery view. We can all see each other now. If you want to just ask a question, you could raise your hand, and maybe Neely can help me if you see someone raising their hand who I can't. Is anyone raising their hand? Or just shout out, unmute yourself. I guess not. In part two.
I'm unmuted.
Okay.
It's Roger.
Okay, Roger.
How did the Jews have such a control over Hollywood and non-Jews didn't get involved in it in the same way?
There were a few people. Daryl Zanuck wasn't Jewish. I think he was Presbyterian. He was head of a studio, and Charlie Chaplin was in a studio with some other celebrities. The reason is simple in many ways: anti-Semitism. When immigrants, when Jewish immigrants came, and almost all the studio heads were immigrants, or their parents were, or they came as little children. I think the Warner Brothers first went to Canada with their parents. I'm not sure if it was Canada, but I think so. Many Jews were not allowed to be in many professions, as many of us know. They were not allowed to be in banking. They were not allowed to be in this. There were quotas in medical schools and law schools, etc. But the film industry in the first few decades of the 1900s was open territory, especially if you moved away from Thomas Edison's group, who had started making films and thought they controlled everything to do with films. It was later proved that they couldn't prevent people from getting into the industry in a court case. But if you move to LA, many, a century ago, Thomas Edison couldn't bother you, and it was an open industry. And so that's one of the reasons. And they also, as immigrants, knew what type of films other immigrants would like, because the beginning film industry basically was popular, not with the affluent, not with those who went to opera and symphony and Shakespearean plays. It was popular with immigrants. They were Nickelodeons, which were located where immigrants lived, in storefronts, in their neighborhoods. They didn't have to travel. Nickelodeons were cheap. It was 5 cents. They were open not 24 hours a day, but probably over, almost the whole day at night as well. So if you were working, you could then go to a movie at night. You didn't have to go to, if you lived in Queens at the time or Brooklyn, you didn't have to go to Manhattan to see a Shakespearean play. Also, there were subtitles. If you didn't know English very well, you may not appreciate a play that was in English, but a film, there was overacting, where it was very obvious to know what was happening. I see some people smiling, and there were subtitles. And therefore, you didn't need to know a lot of English. You could understand the movie or the Nickelodeon film. It was short as well. So if you were a working person, you weren't there seeing Shakespeare or a symphony for 2 hours, and it was inexpensive. So those are some of the reasons why. Okay.
Jews did not control, Jews controlled the production side, but they didn't control all the theaters.
No, they actually controlled a lot of the theaters. A brief synopsis, they didn't control everything. But one of the real fears of the studios, and why they agreed to the Catholic bishops wanting censorship and created Will Hayes to be involved with making Hollywood look good, was that the studios created something that the Supreme Court around 1947, 48, 49, I can't remember, but around then said it was illegal. I'm not sure if it's antitrust, I'm not a lawyer, but they owned the production, they owned the distribution, and they either owned the theaters. That's why you have a Paramount and a Fox theater in Oakland and around the country. I grew up in Loewy's theaters, right? There were a lot of Loewy's theaters.
Right.
Loewy's was not a studio, but they had a relationship with studios. So there was it's called a vertical financial system.
Vertical integration.
Thank you. They knew it was not wrong. They knew that the government would not like it. And for decades, the government, even under Roosevelt, kept on saying, this isn't right, but we're not going to do anything. Eventually, they did. That's why they had to get rid of their studios. And if you look at companies, and I just read it's a very sad book. It's very disgusting. It's a new book about, I'm not sure if it's called Killing Hollywood. It's about Harvey Weinstein. Ken Oletter is the author. If you have a strong stomach, I highly recommend it. It is a tell-all on Harvey Weinstein and the Miramax and later the Weinstein Company. But in it, you realize that there is companies that distribute films and companies that make them. At the time in the 20s and 30s and 40s, until it was outlawed, the studios controlled everything, either themselves or I'll say cahoots isn't nice, by a relationship with a company that owned the studios, not the studios, sorry, the theaters, right? So there was some sort of relationship, which I'm not really up on. That's against the law now.
Good, thank you. That's interesting.
Okay.
By the way, you've done a wonderful job today. I'm
Thank you.
really impressed.
Okay, I hope it is good in the fall. Again, if there are no more questions.
There is another question, wasn't it? Patrick has a question.
Okay, just shout it out. Where are you?
Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah, just say your question.
Well, what did the communists do while Hollywood was focused on the entire anti-fascism messages? Like, how did they benefit or get affected by it?
Very good question, and I left it out just because I was running late. Studio-wise, the question was, what did communism, especially communist groups, supporters in the United States, how did they deal with the studios and with Hollywood at this time? They did do things. As we know, because I've done programs on House Un-American Activities Committee after World War II, there were many people who associated with the Communist Party, especially screenwriters, not all screenwriters, but a greater percentage with the Communist Party. They grew up in the 1930s. They were very sympathetic to everyone having food, a place to live, et cetera, et cetera. So privately, some people, not most of the studio heads, I don't really think that they ever belonged to a communist group, but people who were, sometimes they're called below the line, people who were in the props department, the cinematography, et cetera, were more sympathetic. They also were paid very poorly by the studios, more sympathetic to the communist cause, may have attended meetings. And this was talked about by HUAC from 1947 through the 1950s. There was a group that many celebrities, not all, but did belong to, called the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. That had a communist connection, not that they wanted to destroy America or anything like that, but there were many communists who were connected to this league. It's called HANL in books, Hollywood Anti-Nazi League. What they did was try to put down, until the Stalin-Hitler Pact, which changed things, but they tried to not welcome Leni Riefenstahl when she came to Hollywood, or I think one of the relatives of Mussolini came, trying to say, do not welcome them. Leni Riefenstahl was not given a welcome when she came to LA later in the 30s, and she actually announced that and said they didn't welcome me. The one studio who did, and I didn't mention in all this, and was not run by someone Jewish, was the Walt Disney, the Disney studio. Disney did welcome her. There's a book, I'm not sure who wrote it. I do own the book, but I never read it. Shame on me. About the Disney studio and Walt Disney. Some people think he was anti-Semitic. I don't know. So someone should read the book and let me know. But in any event, Disney welcomed Leni Riefenstahl. The Hollywood Anti-Nazi League tried to prevent that, and they did for most of the studios, saying, you don't want to support what some people called Hitler's director. Certainly Triumph of the Will, and I'll see if we can show a clip of it in November. Triumph of the Will was very, very effective in showing a good side, not a, well, I hate to even say that, a positive side of Hitler as godlike, as crowds of people yearning, and it seemed like especially women yearning as if they could reach out to him as if he was a rock star. It was sort of like the Beatles reaction when the Beatles came to the United States way back in the 60s. She did a very effective and unfortunate documentary, The Triumph of the Will. And so the Hollywood Anti-Nazi League, I won't say blacklisted, but said, don't welcome her. And later, things changed when Hitler and Stalin joined together. That didn't last very long. But yes, that's how the Communist Party in America tried to fight fascism.